Live from the Clarity from Chaos studios, heard worldwide, it's Dave Campbell. On every episode, Dave and his guests explore, discuss, and work on solutions to some of life's biggest challenges. So, if you're ready, be prepared to be enlightened, amused, and even shocked by what you hear. And now, the real, the authentic, the one and only Dave Campbell.
Welcome, everyone. You're listening to Clarity from Chaos. I'm your host, Dave Campbell. If you're new to the show and you like what you hear, please hit the subscribe button at the bottom of this podcast. But before we get into this edition of Clarity, I would like to share a few thoughts with you guys. It is now, to me, a rational conclusion that the COVID-19 virus was built and released on the world for a purpose. I don't know if we will ever find out who was responsible, but it is my belief that it is the same global elites that were causing chaos for democracy worldwide. This threat is not a political one, but a spiritual one, good versus evil. And it's as simple as that. The radicals who are trying to destroy our country are doing so because it was founded on a Judeo-Christian idea, and they can't stand it. We need to stop thinking in terms of Democrat and Republican as our adversaries and start thinking more biblical. We need to bring the church and the Bible into our lives. We need to defeat this threat spiritually. The people we elect need to answer to a higher authority and not to the puppet masters they are answering to today. So with that, I'd like to share a quick Bible verse and then a prayer before we move on. The verse is from Ephesians 5:15 through 16. Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity, because the days are evil. Dear God, thank you for granting me a new day. Please forgive my sins and calm my mind. Keep me safe in the new day and fill my heart with peace. May 2025 bring new joy and opportunities. Amen. To discuss the COVID-19 vaccine and much, much more, we are incredibly pleased to welcome to Clarity Ms. Shaz Khan. Shaz is the author of the new book, fabulous new book, The Ultimate Vaccine Timeline, a fact-packed history of vaccines and their makers. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Dave. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. So let's start with the recent news, and that's around Tylenol. And I'd like to know your thoughts around that, because I did a bunch of research around it, and interestingly enough, none of the research pointed to anything around pregnancy or autism. It pointed to kidney problems, liver problems, jaundice, everything else. No narrative at all around autism.
Oh, I wonder why that is.
Yeah,
I don't think
exactly.
anyone's looking at that. No one is looking at that consciously when they're looking at a drug, even one that's been used for decades.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I was quite surprised that came out, to be honest, but it's not the first time that I've heard that association. I mean, I'd like to quote Dr. Sherry Tenpenny, who'd been writing about this already about 10 years ago. The potential link, and that it merited further investigation to look at the potential use of acetaminophen during pregnancy and the potential outcomes on children that's never been studied. It's only been, I think, looked at basically from independent people, not from the actual authorities who should be looking at it, or the manufacturers themselves, who rarely do actually look at drugs used on pregnant women, because pregnant women are always the protected group of population who you don't usually test drugs on.
That's interesting. Yeah, the acetaminophen's been around since 55, or Tylenol, with McNeil Labs. And then I think Johnson & Johnson acquired McNeil Labs, and then, a couple of years ago, sold them over to Kenvue, which is a different company. But in me tracing that lineage all the way through, no mention of any adverse effects around pregnancy at all. And to your point, if they were a protected class, but I would have thought that autism or any of the other links, because obviously RFK Jr. and Dr. Oz came up with a link through their studies. So it begs the question of why, the big pharma didn't do that testing as well.
Big pharma, unfortunately, aren't known to be the most reliable in testing their drugs once they're on the market.
Okay. Oh, good. Who would have thought that would be adverse to their bottom line? I just find that extraordinary. So as I was starting to talk about, the blowback from big pharma against this has been just, it's been incredible. I mean, I guess, the people that own Tylenol took a rather substantial hit for a couple of days, but it's starting to recover. But they've been all over trying to refute this, and I haven't seen anything that really refutes it. Not yet.
Me neither. But I mean, when you think about it, you can overdose on paracetamol with, I think it's just 9 grams in a day. Obviously, it depends on your body weight and your tolerance
Right.
of it. But if you think that you can already overdose, and people have killed themselves with Tylenol intentionally, knowing that it's toxic, anything like that shouldn't be given to pregnant women for a start. But I guess they're trying to make sure they still have available some medication against pain, obviously. But it's really concerning that I mean, I've never actually looked at the first clinical trials they did with Tylenol back in the 50s, but it'd be interesting to see if they ever did look after it was marketed in pregnant women and what they assessed the toxic doses being. And, I mean, you have baby Tylenol as well. Like, did
Right.
they really look at the safety profile and the long-term outcome on neurological and immune function? On obviously, we know that it's toxic to the kidneys and to the liver. Did they look at that? I don't think so. I doubt it. I mean, my specialty is obviously not Tylenol and autism, but it's a common theme, a common playbook of the pharmaceutical industry, where they put out drugs, they're not tested as vigorously as we would like to think they are, and then they're quite quickly recommended to vulnerable groups like children and pregnant women, and they don't really have the safety data to back it up. So it's kind of like we become the guinea pigs as a consumer.
Sure. Well, yeah, I think COVID-19 is a perfect example of that. They did crappy testing around the thing, and there were known problems with it, but they drove it forward. And I'll get into some of the stuff in your book in a second. But the side effects from acetaminophen are liver damage, kidney problems, gastrointestinal issues, and even aseptic meningitis, which I thought was hadn't been discussed either. So your thoughts on how Oz made the link, and his team made the link to the autism piece, because nobody else was chasing it. So there must have been some kind of link. And obviously the rise in autism has been extraordinary. So I was kind of curious if you had any background around how they hit the...
Well, I think, as I said, that this research has already been going on for about a decade now. And I
Okay.
don't know if the US government actually have figures on how much Tylenol is actually prescribed in the US and how much goes to pregnant women, but it's already been a concern that it could be toxic for regular people and for young children. And I think obviously as they're looking for environmental factors to autism, they look at other drugs that are administered rather liberally during pregnancy, and Tylenol is one of them. I mean, I'm here in Switzerland. We don't tend to medicate as strongly as the US does, but we still have this prevailing kind of assumption that, Tylenol, which is, we call it Panadol here, is safe to use during pregnancy. And I think the studies have been building up and accumulating. And I guess they wanted to look at something that they could potentially link to autism, because autism is such a huge problem. And it's not
Right.
just in the US. I think the US is just one of the countries that has maybe the most transparent statistics when it comes to that. I think it's been an accumulation of looking at the different studies and looking at the neurological impacts, which obviously the nervous system is the main system in the body that conducts everything else. So if you have liver toxicity and kidney issues, you can be sure that it's also affecting the nervous system, because the nervous system is like the number one system in the body. So you can't look at systems just isolated and think they don't interact with each other. But
Sure.
what was the impetus for Dr. Oz to actually bring in that up and bringing that to the public's forefront? I obviously don't know, but it's interesting that they looked at that and that they made
Well,
that
yeah,
statement.
I think it's part of the ongoing transparency that Trump has brought to the new administration. Whereas, obviously we're still learning all things around the COVID-19 issue. So let's get into your book, Shaz. I found it fascinating, and one of the things was the general principles that you start out with at the very start of your book. And I'd like to just walk through those, because if we just look at the COVID-19 vaccine issues over the last couple of years, none of these general principles apply. None of them. Which I sat there and read them, and I went, oh my goodness, So if you want to go through some of this stuff, I'd really appreciate it, because I think your book is so timely. People need to get a copy of it, start reading and understanding the timelines around this stuff, and where the issues are.
Well, it's indeed very timely. I certainly wasn't expecting it. Yeah, the principles of vaccination, which for anybody know, were written by two esteemed bacteriologists and immunologists, so Topley and Wilson. I believe they were both British, yes. And they said, number one, vaccination should be harmless to the healthy child. Number two, the disturbance caused by the vaccine should not be greater than the disease itself. Three, it must be easy to administer, which that it is. Four, vaccination must provide herd as well as individual benefit, which it does for some vaccines allegedly, but not for all of them. And five, vaccine conferred immunity should be sufficiently solid to obviate need for frequent revaccination. The first
Right.
one that never respected that was smallpox, because smallpox vaccination needed to be done on several occasions. It wasn't just 2 or 3 doses. It was
Right.
could be up to 7, 8, and every time there was an epidemic, then get revaccinated.
Right.
So there were a lot of these principles that were violated from day one, I would say. And I think this was the ideal. It was like the ideal principles of vaccination. Like, let's try to get as close as we can to this, but 100 years later, because this was written in 1929, almost 100 years later, we're at a place where vaccination is not harmless to the child. It might not be harmful to every child, but it's certainly not harmless to healthy children. The disturbances caused by vaccines can often be worse than the actual infection itself, because again, we're looking to prevent infection, which usually is, self-limiting, maybe a week or two. But the chronic conditions that we can potentially see following vaccinations often last a lifetime or a few months. The easy to administer part that they got, I would say for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the vaccination must provide herd as well as individual benefit.
Yeah. I
That's an
thought that was
one.
interesting. Yeah.
Because that's basically the play that they made also during COVID, is that you get vaccinated to protect others by the assumption that it prevents transmission, which is what most people believe vaccines do. They prevent transmission of the disease, hence epidemics aren't so likely. Now, this is the case for vaccines, viral vaccines typically, not COVID or the flu, because they don't prevent transmission, and neither does the pertussis bacterial vaccine, does not prevent transmission. It's designed to prevent severe symptoms. Tetanus, not going to prevent transmission, and diphtheria, neither. So a lot of the vaccines that we push and we guilt trip people into taking because they have to protect others, especially those who are immunosuppressed, who cannot get vaccinated themselves, a lot of the vaccines don't even fall under that category. COVID, again, is not one of them. I mean, it really does not prevent transmission. It doesn't prevent infection. And they have this new word, breakthrough infection, to symbolize people who are having COVID after a vaccine. And I believe under VAERS, so the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System in the US, COVID infection was actually the number one reported outcome of COVID vaccination, which is kind of like, why are we vaccinating everybody then? Why aren't we just targeting the vulnerable groups and promoting it as individual protection rather than herd? But of course, they wouldn't have been able to justify mass vaccination if they had said that. So
and they would have been subtracting some zeros off their bottom line, unfortunately, because it's all about the Benjamins. I saw that the CDC is revising their whole protocol now on the booster shots, right, for COVID, which I thought was interesting. As I was reading information from your book, up pops this: the CDC has decided to change their schedule on getting COVID booster shots. I said timing. The timing here is just extraordinary, right?
Well, it's interesting because what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but even if that's a federal recommendation from the CDC, there are states who are now kind of going against it and saying, no, we're not going to listen to the CDC because, Kennedy, the anti-vaxxer, is behind it. So,
I fully expect California to completely trip off the end of the pier and do the same kind of silliness that they did back during, the actual outbreak, and probably several other blue run states as well, which is unfortunate because people seem to, and when I said back in my monologue that I thought it was purposeful, I think from two different aspects. Number one, it showed somebody the ability to control the populace, because they absolutely did. They absolutely controlled everything. And not only here in the States, but globally. I mean, it was the same playbook that they were reading in Italy, that they were reading in Mississippi. I found it extraordinary that they had formulated this whole genre around this virus globally the way they had.
It was a test. I think it was a test to see how far they could push people into compliance. Obviously, fear is their tool, the ultimate tool, because I don't think people will have complied and even asked for more. Some people were demanding stricter restrictions, saying it wasn't enough. And that's just the fear playbook that they've known to manipulate the public's opinion for decades, if not even maybe over centuries.
Right.
So that they did very well, I have to say, from a marketing perspective, which is actually what my background is. They did a fantastic job, and they really were
Absolutely.
able to worldwide scare the populace into compliance. And I think that's where they tested us to see how much would we take, how much
Yep.
suffering could we take, how much encroachment on our individual liberties would we take in the name of public health. Because obviously that's always what the justification was.
Well, yeah, and actually, I think it's rooted itself to the point now to where if you have the common, what I would consider the common flu symptoms, people automatically go to, have you been tested for COVID? If you've got the sniffles or if you've got the cough or if all of a sudden now, have you been tested for COVID? Right? And it's not like I got the damn flu. It's, oh, you've got COVID, So I think you're absolutely right. I think it was a big test case, and I think whoever put all of that together, deserves a pat on the back because it was pretty remarkable. So let's talk a little bit about the vaccine makers and how that consolidation took place and their violations and where we're at today.
So the pharmaceutical industry is a very interesting industry to look at as far as historians go. I mean, it starts the first entry in the timeline which I have, which is specifically for the pharmaceutical acquisitions and mergers and foundations, is Merck, which was it was 1668, if my memory serves me correct. Sorry, I haven't got everything memorized because I've got way too many facts in this book. But it was
You
1668.
do. You've got a lot of facts in that book.
About 1,300 specifically to vaccines, but I actually started with a section on the timelines of vaccine manufacturers because I found it hard to follow who was making what, and because many companies were doing vaccines and then fell out of the vaccine business, but then sold their portfolio to other companies or sold licenses to be able
Right.
to use the formulations under different branding. Yeah, Merck was the first company, basically was established in 1668 as an apothecary, like basically an old pharmacy working with herbs and other, back in the days, we actually had no control over what they were using whatsoever. There was a lot of
Right.
arsenic-based drugs and mercury-based drugs, and basically the pharmaceutical industry has evolved enormously, also thanks to the chemical dye industry and to the petrochemical industry, of course, because we know that most modern pharmaceuticals are derived from the coal tar industry. Hence why Rockefeller's name will obviously come up as well a lot in his Standard Oil and his interests in the pharmaceutical industry and in medical education as a result, because he was able to steer medical education around pharmaceuticals and to the detriment of other modalities which we were using at the times, like herbs, homeopathy,
Right.
chiropractic. He basically kind of run that out of the market to have a monopoly on pharmacology. So that actually really helped boost obviously the pharmaceutical industry. Then the Industrial Revolution, of course, with the mass production of pills. Mass production of vaccines didn't come till later. I mean, back in the days, the first smallpox vaccine wasn't really an injection. It was just a scrape into the superior layers of the skin. But with the first toxoid vaccines were injected, they were glass and metal. So they were expensive. They had to be disposed of or boiled. I'm sure they reused them, and there were a lot of sanitary issues, obviously, just with
Right.
that, for reusing syringes. And then we had in the 1950s, 1960s, the mass plastics. So the mass generation of one-use syringes, which also helped the pharmaceutical industry just produce way more quantities of vaccines. And worldwide, the worldwide distribution of vaccines already started in the early 20th century, with the big players being Burroughs Wellcome, which today we know as GSK, and the other one being Park Davis, which I believe was bought by Merck as well. I can check. But yeah, I have in my book, I have a section where I show the different logos of all the different companies. Sorry, Park Davis was obtained by Pfizer down the line because they obtained Wyeth, who was a big vaccine manufacturer in Lederle. And then there was also Sanofi, who acquired Institut Pasteur, Institut Mérieux. So that was the European side, but otherwise GSK, Wellcome Burroughs Wellcome had the kind of monopoly in the UK, Merck in the US. Pharmaceutical industry, then the biotech industry came into play in the 1970s when we started when we started tinkering with viruses and tinkering with DNA and genetically modified organisms. That created a whole kind of new market to be able to create things that we could then patent. And the first genetically modified vaccine actually was a hepatitis B that came out in 1986 that replaced the plasma derived from the blood of hepatitis B victims, which how could that be a good idea? But anyway, that replaced that vaccine from 1981. So in 1986, we had the first genetically modified vaccine, which was made by Merck, and then GSK, back in the day, SmithKline French, came out with theirs quickly afterwards. And that's the same vaccine that was then administered from 91 in the US to newborns. And it contained thimerosal and aluminum and was a genetically modified organism and hadn't been tested for longer than 5 days. And that's been actually pretty much confirmed, because people still have trouble believing that, me included, that they could test a completely new, novel product on newborns and only look for safety after 5 days. But anyway, so the vaccine manufacturer, before the Vaccine Injury Act of 1980 US, the vaccine manufacturers were going out of business slowly because of litigation, because of lawsuits that they were having to pay out millions for vaccine damage, which, before the Vaccine Injury Act, pharmaceutical companies had to pay out of pocket basically for any injuries. So the government came in because their supply was threatened. I mean, it's the only industry I know of that nearly went bankrupt because of lawsuits. And I'm talking about industry, not just one company. So they came in to save them basically and said, no, you not have to pay for any more damages linked to your products. You have a free pass. You put vaccines on the market. We promote them. We buy them. And we're going to, even mandate them. And you don't have to worry about that. And that was the impetus to an explosion of vaccine products on the market, especially in the US, but it's not only in the US, in other countries, here in Europe, in the developing nations. A lot more manufacturers came into play as well, because even though this law only applied for the US, there were other laws in other countries that also gave the same kind of protection to vaccine manufacturers. So in the UK in 1979, we had the Vaccine Damage Payment Act, which also served as a barrier to prevent the pharmaceutical industry from being sued for their products when they're caused injury. Now, you can sue if you go through the actual steps that are in place by the government. You can try, if you want to go up against the pharmaceutical industry, good luck. You have to have lots of money, patience, and time. But you could try to sue them for willful neglect or not informing the doctor about this possible side effects, and then the doctor obviously not informing the patient.
Well,
but
but then you've got the AMA in your back pocket. You've got, because they promote the stuff they're told to promote. It was very much the Oxycontin comes to mind very quickly about being promoted, but it really makes you wonder who the beneficiary was when this legislation was passed, because to your point, poor practices almost drove a industry out of business, only to be protected by the political elites. So I just, the chip that they must have with the pharmaceutical industry must be enormous.
It's infiltrated all levels of politics.
Public
health.
Yeah, and I can't speak for the British health situation, but it just seems to me to be counterintuitive the way it's set up here in the United States.
Well, I believe that there was some intention of trying to help or protect the few that they believed were injured by vaccines, because obviously it's always a risk benefit on you have a collateral damage for the greater good, and they wanted to make the whole process less litigious. So in the beginning, because obviously the lawsuits before, they take years, but I think that, from what I've researched and what I've seen from the early days, is it was supposed to create a non-litigious, easy compensation program so that those few rare people who were injured by vaccines could get quickly compensated. But unfortunately, we saw that evolved into something much more dire, which really didn't favor the victims. And there are a lot more victims than I think people would like to believe.
Well, the lawyers weren't getting paid in that regard then, because if you were quickly compensating the injured, the lawyers weren't getting their cut. So we had to string it out, right? We had to elongate the process so that the lawyers then could participate in a much longer period of time. So their billing went a lot longer, and so on and so forth. If you just had somebody call up Pfizer and say, look, you're the reason for my wife's death. I want $100,000. And Pfizer went, okay, here's $100,000. That you're cutting a lot of people out of the revenue process that's around all of this.
Yeah, for sure. Again, I'm sure the lawyers were making good money beforehand already, but I think now an average case takes several years to litigate. So of course, yeah, lawyers get paid, of course, and they still
Sure.
are because they are still doing the work. And I don't think it's easy for someone to try and do this on their own unless they have a legal background.
I
Because they're actually
wouldn't.
suing the government. They're not suing the manufacturer. They're suing the government. They're suing
That was
HHS.
going to be my next question. Since the government gave the free pass to the pharmaceutical industry, who's actually fitting the foot in the bill here? It sounds like the taxpayers are actually paying for their own demise, so to speak, because they're supporting the pharmaceuticals through this various legislation, and the people, the victims, are trying to sue, to get some kind of compensation. So it's just kind of like running around the tree, right? It's just amazing.
Absolutely. It's the taxpayer who's footing the bill. The
Yeah.
taxpayer is paying for the injury. Taxpayer is paying for the vaccines. Taxpayer is paying for the promotion and the marketing of the vaccines because the government does that for them. And there is a tax that's levied on every single vaccine that's sold, and that is put towards a fund, which then is used to pay out the injuries. And I believe the figure is $5 billion to this day, since 1989, when it really was put into place, is the amount of injuries that have been paid out. And the one that has been paid out the most is flu vaccine.
Wow. Do the universities, since the universities are part of this whole research and development situation, how do they get entwined in all of this? Because I think like Harvard, there's a lot of research and development that's done on the college and university campuses and then sold or whatever, given to the pharmaceuticals. Or so do they have any play in any of this stuff, Shaz?
Absolutely. In the universities and the institutions, academic institutions, they often receive money from the NIH or Wellcome Fund, which are the two biggest funders. I mean, there's also the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. There's over the Novo Nordisk Foundation, which is even bigger than Bill and Melinda Gates, but they're a bit more discreet. They provide grants to institutions to develop certain medications or certain vaccines. I mean, the vaccine against hepatitis B was developed at University of California and University of Washington. So they receive the grants to develop the technologies, if you will. Then they patent the technologies, and then they benefit from the technology that they receive royalties from. Now, what was a big change in the US was the 1980 Doyle Act, which basically allowed public money to be used, not just, Bill and Melinda Gates essentially you say is a private foundation, but NIH is essentially also taxpayer money. So taxpayer money could be used to be funding these inventions or these innovations, and then when they actually get patented, the academics who worked on the research could receive royalties. So even though the taxpayer paid for it, it was the researcher who would be benefiting from it. Now, usually there's a time frame on it, about 17 years for a patent, but it can be extended if there's any patent infringement cases. And so it's become very entwined. And basically the vaccine industry now is dependent on these academic institutions, be it the University of Oxford in the UK, the University of Washington, which is heavily funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates, I guess Harvard as well, Stanford.
Yeah.
All these Ivy League institutions receive money grants they're called, to develop technologies, which then are used for private benefit. So there is, unfortunately, it was supposed to drive innovation, and because if there's no profit, pharmaceutical companies aren't interested, their bottom line is making money.
Yeah, exactly. So is there a website where people can go out and get facts and information, Shaz, around what you've written here?
So I have made some sample chapters available of my book on the website that goes with the book called theultimatevaccinetimeline.com.
Okay.
I also take some extracts from the book and write some other articles, particularly around, for instance, the financials around vaccines on my Substack, which is Indie Researcher, INDIE, researcher.substack.com. And I also publish information not about vaccines, but about health and science in general and ethics, for instance, on my website, healthsciencesimplified.com. If obviously the timeline is only available in the book in its entirety.
Yeah.
But there are definitely segments you can check out on the website for free if you want to see how it's formatted and to get an idea of the style.
The book, the Ultimate Vaccine Timeline is just amazing. And I don't think there's any other works out there right now that actually compiles all of this in one place like you've done. So it's just remarkable. And I think when you go through and start reading it and hopefully trying to understand some of this, it just becomes, it's some of the stuff that's going on is just unconscionable when you actually start diving into this. So a big hat tip to the work that you've done to put this book together. It's just terrific.
Thank you so much, Dave.
So we've been talking to Shaz Khan about her new book, The Ultimate Vaccine Timeline, and I encourage everyone to get a copy of this. Where they can find it, on Amazon?
Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, and if you have a local bookstore, to keep our local bookstores alive, you can order it in because it's available through their distribution network. But yeah, it's on Amazon and Barnes and Nobles primarily.
It's just terrific. Thank you so much for spending the time that you've had. I know the big time difference between here and in the UK, so I really appreciate you spending the time to come on with us.
Yeah, my pleasure. And I think that's why the timing was. I'm in Switzerland, which is 1 hour difference from the UK, so that's why it's 6 hours and not 5. But thank you so much for having me. It's much appreciated.
Absolutely. And our upcoming guest for Thursday and the following Tuesday, we're going to have Richard Lyons on Thursday and Dr. Gio Gianni on Tuesday. So be prepared for that. And again, thank you to Miss Shaz Khan for spending the time with us, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening. If you would like to listen to more Clarity from Chaos shows on demand, go to clarityfromchaos.buzzsprout.com or send Dave an email at info@clarityfromchaos.com for information on previous shows. You can also listen to the show on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Twitter, or Google Podcast. Until next time, please remember, it's not about waiting for the storm to pass. It's about learning to dance in the rain. Be well, everyone.